Now that we've talked about what things are controlled under the export regulations, let's talk about what activities are controlled. Both the EAR and the ITAR are primarily focused on three activities: exports, re-exports, and in-country transfers. Let's dig into how each of these activities is defined. So first, what is an export? When it comes to physical things, both the ITAR and the EAR explain that an export is any movement of a thing from inside the US to outside the US. I might export a thing by shipping it in a cargo ship, shipping it by parcel delivery like FedEx, or even by carrying it in my luggage when I travel internationally. So what about exporting technology and software? Technology and software can be exported out of the US in the same ways that physical commodities can be exported, but they can also be exported by transmission out of the US. For example, I could email technology or software to someone outside of the US, or I could upload the technology or software to a server that's located outside the US, or even a server that's located inside the US, but that people outside the US have access to. Or I could travel outside the US with the technology or software on my laptop or other devices. Now, this is not an exhaustive list, it is just a few examples. Now, we'd like to take a moment to really hammer a point home. At various times, we've had clients say to us, "Yes, I took that part out of the country, but it was just for a trade show. I didn't sell it to anybody, so it wasn't an export." We've also heard, "Yeah, I took the equipment with me to Mexico, but I only used it for personal use, and I brought it right back, so it wasn't an export." This is very flawed thinking. The word export is not defined by your purpose. An export is any movement or transmission out of the US. Your purpose doesn't matter. It also doesn't matter whether you're making any money by taking the thing out of the country. The definition of export under both the ITAR and the EAR does not care about your reasons. Let's take a quick look at a rather silly example. Imagine that I'm driving around in Texas and I accidentally cross the border into Mexico. I immediately realize my mistake, throw the car into reverse, and I cross right back over into the US. In this instance, I have just exported my car to Mexico and I have re-imported it into the US. Same goes for the clothes that I'm wearing, the smartphone in my pocket, and the bag of fast food on the passenger seat. Anytime something leaves the United States, regardless of how long or the purpose of the trip, the thing has been exported. Now, there are a few exceptions. For example, when you're sending something from the continental US to Hawaii, or to a US possession, or perhaps a US military base in a foreign country, but we won't go into those exceptions right now in this video. We'll save that for another time. Next, let's talk about a rather frustrating concept called a deemed export. A deemed export is when a US person and a foreign person are both physically in the US, and the US person simply shows technology or software to the foreign person. For example, imagine that I have an office in Texas where I manufacture satellites, and imagine that I hire an employee from China to work for me. When my Chinese employee arrives at the office, she can see EAR and ITAR controlled technology all over the office. She sees detailed drawings on the whiteboard, she sees schematics and software on the computer. I orally communicate information to her about how the satellites work, and she's given access to the satellite itself, where she can see how the circuits are laid out and other information about how the satellite is put together. The US government treats this scenario as if I have exported all of this controlled information to China, even though the information never actually left my office. Now, presumably, this is because the information is now in my Chinese employee's head, and she can just go back to China with the information and build the satellite to a similar extent as if I had just emailed the information to her in China. But not so fast. I've actually tricked you a little bit. You see, the deemed export rule only applies if my Chinese employee fits within the definition of a foreign person. So let's talk about what that definition is. Fortunately, both the EAR and the ITAR define foreign person the same way. First, it's important to understand that the word person is used in laws to mean both human beings as well as corporations and other non-human entities. When we're talking about humans, a foreign person is any human that is not a US citizen, not a green card holder, and not in the US under asylum. So back to our last hypothetical, if my Chinese employee had dual US citizenship, or if she had a green card, or if she was in the US under asylum, then she would not be considered a foreign person, and it wouldn't be a deemed export for me to share technology with her at my office. This is why a lot of foreigners who come to work in the US, to work in the space industry, will try to get their green cards quickly so they can have quicker access to EAR and ITAR technology. So aside from human persons, with respect to a business entity, a foreign person is any business entity that is incorporated or organized outside of the US. Also, any agency or division of a foreign government will also be considered a foreign person. All right, that's it for deemed exports. Next, let's talk about a special category of exports that only applies to a few commodities. With this small group of commodities, the term export can include transferring registration, control, or ownership of these things. First, let's look at the ITAR. Under the ITAR, you can export aircraft, ocean vessels, and satellites by transferring registration, control, or ownership to a foreign person. Okay, simple enough. Next, the EAR has a very similar rule applying to spacecraft. And be aware that the EAR definition of spacecraft actually includes satellites as well as other types of spacecraft. Specifically, under the EAR, you can export a spacecraft by transferring registration, control, or ownership to a person in another country or to a national of a foreign country. Note the distinction here. Under the ITAR's rule, an export occurs when you transfer registration, ownership, or control of a satellite to a foreign person. And we know what the definition of a foreign person is already because we just discussed that. But under the EAR's rule, an export occurs when you transfer registration, ownership, or control of a satellite to any person who is in a foreign country, and presumably even to an American citizen in a foreign country. Or if you transfer to a national of another country, presumably even someone who is a dual US citizen. We don't know why this distinction exists, but it's super important to be aware of it. Okay, that's it for exports. Now let's very briefly discuss re-exports. So imagine that I'm in the US and I ship a package to Canada. In other words, I have just exported the package to Canada. Now imagine that the Canadian person who received my package puts the package back in the mail and ships the package to China. This would be a re-export of the package. Both the EAR and the ITAR are concerned with re-exports because a lot of bad actors will use them to get around the rules. For example, it might be impossible for me to ever get a license from the US government to send a particular piece of equipment to China. But I might be able to ship the exact same item to Canada, maybe even without having to get a license. So in order to get around the regulations, I might ship the item to a friend in Canada and then ask him to re-export it to China. This kind of stuff happens a lot, so the US government has rules in place dealing with re-exports. Finally, let's talk about in-country transfers. Now, there are two flavors of in-country transfer. Under the first variety, imagine that I'm in the US and I successfully get a license to ship a piece of equipment to Company A in China. The US government is comfortable with Company A, and my license says that I can only ship my equipment to Company A. So I ship my equipment to Company A. Then, once Company A receives the equipment, they turn around and hand the equipment over to a different Chinese company, which we'll call Company B. This would be considered an in-country transfer, and obviously the US government is concerned about this type of activity, which would evade the licensing rules. Okay, so the second flavor of in-country transfer is very similar to the first, but this time we're just dealing with Company A. Imagine that I successfully get a license to export my equipment to Company A, but the license says that Company A can only use the equipment for a very specific purpose. Now imagine that I ship my equipment to company A, and once they receive it, they start using the equipment in a way that is different from what is allowed under the license. This would be considered an in-country transfer of the equipment, and both the EAR and the ITAR have rules in place dealing with this sort of activity. Okay, that's it for this video, but just before we sign off, we want to make you aware that there are more activities that are controlled by both the ITAR and the EAR. We've listed some of these activities on this screen here. Unfortunately, we can't go into everything in this short introductory series, but we will discuss these other activities in other video series that go deeper into the ITAR and the EAR individually. But if you want to pause this screen for a moment and take a look, of course you are free to do so. Okay, that's it. Thanks. We'll see you in the next one.